Okay,
Okay, we good?
you're good.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Thanks for everybody being here this morning. I appreciate your tuning in for part two of our lecture about architecture. And I'm just delighted you're here. I think that architecture can really expand your mind, expand your view of the world. Maybe you're going to go out now and drive around Philadelphia and see some of these buildings in a new light and
Hmm.
get excited about this subject of modernism. A lot of people will say, I don't like modern architecture. Well, they need to learn more. You're learning more now. We'll talk about it for 1 hour this morning. And you're going to learn more, I hope, about where modernism came from and what it means to us in Philadelphia. And we were talking last time about Lou Kahn, this remarkable man, this towering figure in the history, one of the Philadelphians we're most proud of. And we had left off with Lou Kahn. He's trained at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a talented artist, but he wants to be an architect. He studies with Paul Cray at UPenn, comes out into the world, and then very quickly the Depression is going to derail his architectural career and everybody else's architectural career. The Depression is a massive blow to the practice of architecture. In fact, the Depression really is the great um, turning point in the history of American architecture, because with the Depression, and especially with the young architects, they become very disillusioned with the old ways of doing things. The old clientele is broke. No one's building the great estates out on the main line. Architects are scrambling to find new ways of making a living and new ways of building that are more economical, that are more modern, more up to date. This is a pressing concern in the 1930s. How do we respond to the automobile age, the age of the airplane, the age of the airship, the age of the movie theater? All these new things are coming. Architecture, meanwhile, for the younger architect, seems almost stuck in the past, stuck in the Renaissance, stuck in the Victorian period. So Lou Kahn is one of these young architects who's really gung-ho to find a new way of designing buildings. And the Depression is a great stimulus in that direction. The Depression leads to a lot of government work, a lot of government employment for architects. That's practically all the work they can find. And a lot of the work is going to be in public housing. So we need to talk a little bit about what is public housing. Public housing is this radical idea that the federal government ought to pay for the house that you live in. The federal government ought to give you a house if you're a poor person. This is a new, quite shocking idea. It starts in England with what we call council houses, like the one you see here in London. This is public housing, starts in England in the 1890s, government funded housing for the poor. Look at the style of the architecture. It's extremely traditional. The earliest public housing is all in an historical type of architecture. Public housing comes to the United States when a socialist mayor in Milwaukee builds public housing right after World War One. Again, here too, the architecture is entirely traditional. These look like ordinary American houses. You'd never know, would you, that the government is funding this. The government has these houses in this really radical experiment to give people a home. Well, this idea is going to come to Philadelphia, and it's going to come in the guise of the New Deal. We need to talk about Oscar Stonerov, because the architect Oscar Stonerov really propounds this idea that what America needs is public housing like they're beginning to build in Europe. Stonerov was German. He comes over here and settles in Philadelphia and begins his architectural career as one of the really important modernists. Now, Stonerov is kind of a forgotten figure today, which I think is unfortunate because he was a key figure in Philadelphia in the middle of the 20th century. In fact, you see him there on the right, and he's rubbing shoulders with Frank Lloyd Wright, no less, studying a model of Wright's Guggenheim Museum in the 1950s. So Stonerov was a big deal. And Stonerov, as we see, is going to partner with Lucan, the young architect who he greatly admires for his radical new ideas, and he's going to partner with George Howe. Let me let the dog in the room before she scratches the door off. Just a sec. Okay, sorry about that. There you go. Okay. So Stonerov not only is a European architect and extremely adept at modernism, but Stonerov has literally written the book on Le Corbusier. So Stonerov is a huge disciple of that French architect's modernism. And Stonerov is going to bring that right to us in Philly, ready or not, with the Carl Mackley houses. The Carl Mackley houses. These are in the Northeast. They're near Frankfurt, and they are built in 1933, 34. Now, as you look at these, you might think, I've seen lots of buildings like that, but no, you really haven't. If you were in Philadelphia in the 1930s, this would have knocked your socks off as radically new and strange and very, very different. For one thing, do these look like houses? Where are the attributes of the typical house on the main line? Where is the slate roof? Where are the picturesque chimneys? Where is the decorative front door? Where are the shutters? The porches? All of these attributes of houses are stripped away, and the modern American is made to live in something much more almost factory-like, very utilitarian, very spare. Now, why is this? Partly it's economy. This is the federal government paying for the construction of these houses in a joint program with the hosiery union. So this is an alliance between labor and the federal government under Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's kind of a remarkable thing. You wouldn't quite see this today, would you? But this is the government plunging in with great zeal and great energy to provide housing for factory workers in Philadelphia in the Depression. So economy is key, and all the adornments are stripped away. This is as simple and unadorned as it can be. Not even a cornice at the top of the building, like you see in so many old Philadelphia buildings. Not even a cornice up there at the top. Photograph here shows the Mackley houses nearing completion, and this is a huge project. It's the size of a city block. Up close, we see Stonerov using the real Le Corbusier details. Look at those concrete columns. Now, those concrete columns, they don't look like Greece or Rome, do they? You don't see the carved base. You don't see the fluting. You don't see the carved capital at the top. No, they are pared down to that ultra simplicity that Le Corbusier preached. And as you go into that opening, look up, you can actually see the concrete beam attaching to the concrete column, and it's just on display. It's just literally, you're supposed to look up and admire the construction. Form follows function. This is very rigorous. No decoration at all, but the interest visually comes from the construction itself. As you look up, you see these funny little protruding balconies that might remind you of a steamship, like you're sailing across the ocean in the 20s and 30s. Those come straight from the Bauhaus by Walter Gropius. I showed you a picture of those balconies last week. Look at the windows, they're steel, just very, very utilitarian type windows. And look at the walls. The walls are non-traditional. They're not stone. They're not even brick. They are clay tile. The equivalent today would be like building a building with cement block and showing the cement block all the way up. This was extremely radical at the time. But to Stonerov, the clay tile was clean. It's glazed, so it washes clean in the rain, and it is economical, and it's super modernist. Another innovation with the Mackley houses is that there is the accommodation of the automobile. As we saw with the Villa Savoye last time by Le Corbusier, you're supposed to park your car under the building. Same with the Mackley houses. You park your car in an underground parking garage built into the complex. I doubt many of the hosiery workers could have afforded that fancy car, though, that we see pulling out in this early photograph that was in an architectural magazine. This building, it's plain, it's not lovely. You're probably not falling in love with it exactly, but it's historically awfully important. This is by the Public Works Administration, the PWA, which is part of the New Deal. And the PWA is going to build 34,000 projects across the United States. I mean, this is a real New Deal push to transform America under Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the PWA practically begins here at the Mackley houses. This may be the first public housing project by the federal government in American history. There's one in Atlanta, but it's been demolished, and I'm not sure it's actually any earlier. So this is really historic, not just architecturally, but in terms of public planning and public policy. 3% of Americans today live in public housing, 3%. So this becomes a significant player in the history of urbanism in the United States, and it starts right here in Philadelphia. It was very, very progressive. It even had a swimming pool in the inner courtyard for the children. And it still stands today. A lot of early modernism, as you've seen, has been demolished, but the Mackley houses are still there, and you can admire the glazed terracotta tile blocks, if that's your thing. Let's go to Coatesville, Pennsylvania. Now it's World War II, and there's further need for government intervention in housing. In particular, the steel workers in Coatesville. The steel workers during the war, it's obviously a critical wartime effort. Some of the steel workers are white, some are black. Under the segregated policies of the 1940s, the black housing is separate from the white housing. To build the black public housing in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, they bring in a consortium of Stonerov, Lou Kahn, and George Howe. So those three architects swallow their pride and form a consortium to share in this scarce government work that becomes available during the war. And this is called Carver Court. And this is one of the houses of Carver Court. It's a duplex. And there are lots of these in Carver Court, arranged around a kind of circular pattern. You drive in, it's very automobile based. You drive into the complex and you're able to park your car under your house. This for 1942 is extraordinarily advanced. And this is the design of Lou Kahn. In fact, this is one of Lou Kahn's first really significant projects. It's small scale, it's not dazzling, but it's extremely interesting architecture. As Le Corbusier had done, Kahn raises the building up, he raises the living space up off the ground, you're perched in the air, so that you can, in a utilitarian sense, park your car under where you live and then climb up to your residence. And look at the use of concrete. Kahn had wanted the whole thing to be concrete. He's really getting interested in that material, but because of economy, the house itself is wooden. The piers underneath are concrete. But look how bold those concrete piers are. Look at those big shadows that are cast. It's quite a dramatic statement using exposed concrete. And again, 1942, that's very early. Again, it doesn't really communicate house, does it? Where's the chimney? Where are the shutters? Where's the pitched roof? It has an almost flat roof. Almost flat. If you go to Carver Court today, and somewhat to my surprise, it's still there. People are still living in these houses. If you go today, what's kind of fun is to see they've all been altered. Every one of them has been altered. In some cases, as you see, the residents have filled in the parking bay, and the parking bay becomes the downstairs of their home. But in other cases, you can still see the concrete piers. But look what's happened upstairs. That exposed wooden siding, very rustic, has been replaced with vinyl siding. And look at the pitch of the roof. The roof has been turned into a more typical home-like pitched roof. So in a sort of gentle alteration, these houses have come to look more like the traditional American home than Lucan had intended them to look originally. Probably the culprit here is a leaky flat roof that has been rectified by turning it into a pitched roof. Intriguingly, Carver Court has been discovered, having languished for decades, totally forgotten. It has been discovered. It's even gotten an historical marker. And this is one of the few historical markers anywhere that's about architects and credits the architects. You'll see there that the project was designed by 3 renowned architects. Is that how you spell renowned? I'm suddenly doubting it. Louis Kahn, George Howe, and Oscar Stonerom. So that's terrific that these 3 very important modernists get a little credit. Howe is summoned to head the architecture school at Yale in 1950, and he will die young in 1954. Howe, going to Yale, he joins Lucan, who is teaching at Yale ever since 1947. So the relationship between Philadelphia and Yale is now developed. And we're going to see Bob Venturi later teaching at Yale and being closely tied in with the Yale faculty. This is significant because Lucan's first famous building is going to be for Yale University, commissioned in 1950, the year that George Howe goes to Yale to teach, or rather to run the School of Architecture. And that's the new art gallery for Yale University. You see in the diagram, Kahn is commissioned to add a wing to an older art gallery. In fact, there were 2 previous art galleries. The kind of brownish one on the right is 19th century. One in the middle is 1920s. And then Kahn adds the section you see on the far left. And this is, as I say, one of Lucan's most famous buildings, most celebrated buildings, and it's one that you ought to know. For 1953, when this opens, this was extraordinarily new and daring and innovative in the United States. I mean, I dare say no American had ever seen anything like this when this building opened. Curtain walls on 2 sides, bold curtain walls that run from the ground all the way to the sky. There's no cornice. There's nothing at the top that suggests here comes the roof. It's just glass all the way up, and glass set flush with the wall to really emphasize that this is a sheer curtain. The detailing, exquisite, the proportions, perfectly modulated. Unfortunately, the curtain wall was a disaster in terms of heating and air conditioning inside the building. I think there are very few museum directors today that would request a curtain wall in an art museum, of all things. I mean, my goodness, the light is so damaging to art. But this is at the dawn of time. This is 1953. No one really was quite aware of that. But there were severe condensation problems inside the glass. In recent years, the glass has been replaced with a better glass, a better curtain wall, and the building is cherished and honored today. That's the old art gallery there on the right, built in a very traditional kind of neo-Gothic style in the 1920s. And there's the Kahn building on the left, joining the older building. The older building is only 30 years older. Kind of astonishing if you think about it. The old section is only 30 years older than the new section. But there has been a revolution in the history of architecture in the meantime. Between the mid-20s and 1950, there's been a revolution in architecture, and Luke Kahn is bringing that revolutionary style to America. Now, you can ask yourself, do you like this development in the history of architecture? I've seen this photograph in books that want to show that architecture has become debased, that modern architecture is a disaster, that modern architecture is a huge blunder. I've seen this very photograph to try to prove that point, that the richness, the elaborateness, the humanity of the old building is replaced by something cold, mechanical, unfeeling. You do see that argument. And you may be looking at the slide thinking, I would rather live in 1925 than to live in the modern world with architecture totally transformed. But if you like modern architecture, you appreciate the sensitivity with which Kahn develops his new building. It's not about ornament. It's not about adornment. Nothing looks applied to Kahn's building. Nothing is carved by hand. There are no references to the historical past whatsoever. All of those are gone. Kahn would have said, what are you doing building a Gothic church building in the age of the automobile? Kahn would have said that architecture on the right is irrelevant, bogus, pretentious, terribly expensive, pointless in the modern world. As Le Corbusier said, the Greeks built their temples, we build our automobiles. That's our work. And Kahn is crafting an architecture for our modern world. Modern world. And so he strips away adornment. How does he make the building interesting? It's all through a rigorous geometry, careful proportions, and intelligent use of materials, colors, color of the glass, the color of the mullions of the windows, the color of the bricks, super carefully calibrated. And I so admire the way that there's that strip of glass that runs from top to bottom where the two buildings join, so that Kahn's building seems to very just gently nudge, bump up against the older building. The inside really is what's famous, that great ceiling. Yale University said, sometimes we need classroom space, sometimes we need exhibition space. We want the interior to be as open as possible so we can move things around. And Kahn gave them that. The structure of the building is huge concrete piers, widely spaced, supporting a simply immense ceiling of poured concrete. So as you look up, you see this incredible vista of a poured concrete frame in the shape of tetrahedrons. It's a giant tetrahedron frame. This is radically new. I think even today, this would seem very, very striking if you saw this in a building today. Traditionally, when you look up at a ceiling, you see white plaster. And that's all you see is just white plaster. No information about what's going on above that. But here, you really feel like you're seeing the floor above you. You're seeing the floor slab. And remember, I talked last time about how important floor slab is to the modernists. Floor slab is almost the key to understanding a building. So Kahn lets us see the floor slab. Kahn said, it's so beautiful. And also, it's like a giant electrical plug. Now, what did he mean by that? The ceiling is so beautiful. So there's an aesthetic dimension that's important to Kahn, but at the same time, it's like an electrical plug, meaning you can see all the lights, you can see all the wires for the lights, you can see the fire suppression system. Everything is visible. And yes, if you need an electrical outlet, I'm sure there are 100 exposed in the ceiling so that things can be moved all around in the gallery and just plugged into the ceiling. So that distinctly Kahn combination of the very utilitarian and practical, and yet the very aesthetic and striking and new. There's that ceiling. You probably couldn't do this today. Concrete, as you may know, is very expensive now, and pouring concrete is problematic. When you pour concrete, you often get imperfections in the pour. So architects today much prefer precast pieces of concrete. So to see the whole enormous ceiling poured in a single colossal slab, like something the Romans might have attempted, it's very inspiring and very remarkable to see that use of technology in 1950. So Kahn teaches at Yale as a lecturer, but he's very much ensconced in Philadelphia, and he's trying to get commissions in Philadelphia, and it's hard work. Philadelphia remains basically a conservative place with conservative architectural traditions and old architectural firms. And modernism, in spite of the PSFS, really is slow to take hold in Philly. And Kahn is going to be nearly 60 years old before he gets the Great Commission at the University of Pennsylvania. Kahn's career really is deferred because of the Depression, the war, and then the slowness with which modernism is accepted. Kahn's career really doesn't get going until he's 60. And then at the end of his life, he compresses an inhuman amount of work into the last 14 years of his life. He just works in a frenzied way, ultimately collapsing and dying young of a heart attack. It's a tragic story. Kahn had a vision for Philly. He was going to bring Le Corbusier principles to Center City. Kahn wanted to tear down City Hall. City Hall, that great Victorian monstrosity, as he would have regarded it, a now meaningless and outdated hulk of overly adorned granite. Kahn wanted to tear down City Hall and put in place something more like tetrahedrons. And so he and one of the partners and his architect spent many, many months designing a replacement City Hall, which would have looked something like this. And again, today, I think even now would be considered shockingly modern, shockingly advanced. Never happened. Probably none of us is terribly sorry that this didn't replace our beloved City Hall, our beloved Billy Penn on the top. This didn't happen. But Kahn does get a commission, a very, very small, very modest commission in Trenton, New Jersey, that's going to be extremely important, again, in the history of American architecture. These are the Trenton bath houses. And the Trenton bath houses, again, they're very small, very modest, very ordinary, but you will see these illustrated in many, many histories of American architecture. This is considered one of the key buildings of the 1950s, the Trenton bath houses. Awfully small. When you go see it, and I'm happy to say they're still in use every summer, and kids are still splashing in the pool, and the buildings have been restored. It's lovely to see. But you'll be shocked at how small this is. Very, very, very modest. And even as small as it is, Kahn said, I'd love to have these bathhouses be all concrete. And they said, no, sorry, you'll have to just cut costs. And so he uses cement block instead of concrete. Let's talk about the Trenton bathhouse. These are for the Jewish community in Trenton, New Jersey. This is the Jewish swimming club on the west side of Trenton. Kahn's design for the bathhouses features these 4 pavilions that you can see in the model on the left. You enter at the bottom, you go through an open courtyard at the middle of the 4 pavilions, then you climb some steps up to the swimming pool, and the swimming pool is beyond this complex. The problem here for Kahn, quite the simple one, is you've got to separate out where the boys change into their swim trunks and where the girls change into their bathing suits. So boys and girls separate, and he does that with the 2 pavilions on either side. But his genius idea is that the whole complex becomes unified as these 4 interlocking pavilions. And each of the pavilions has at its corner a great rectangular structure. And you see that on all of them, these almost castle-like corners with a rectangular concrete block box. And all of these boxes have a different function. Some of those boxes at the corners are to house the chlorine for the pool. Some of those boxes house the janitorial supplies. Some of those boxes house, as we'll see, the entrances into the changing rooms. Some of those boxes house the showers. Some house the bathrooms. To architectural historians, these are what Kahn called the servant spaces. They are serving the rest of the complex. They are the utilitarian pieces, and they're relegated to the corner. And everything else becomes the served space where people have fun, where people have activities. So there's a sense here of separating out utilitarian from the more pleasant, and it shows. Form follows function. You can see the function of the building from the outside. If we walk up close, you'll see what I mean about those big projecting boxes on the corners and this remarkable wooden roof that appears to float above the whole complex. 4 of these pyramidal roofs. I think it has an almost Egyptian feel, which Kahn might have meant deliberately as an allusion to the history of the Jewish people in that part of the world. It's unadorned. It's grimly unadorned. If you need your moldings and your sculptures and architecture, you're not going to find them here. But there is a little mural, a kind of delightful little mural by Kahn himself, usually overlooked, but there it is, you can see. And Kahn, in fact, was a talented mural painter. This is a mural by Lou Kahn inside a Philadelphia house that still survives today from 1960. You can see that Kahn really was a cubist painter. And I think we need that to help us understand his architecture. That cubist idea of fragmenting things, blowing them into their discrete parts so that we can see each individual part separately in a fragment, and then we see the whole. That certainly happens at the bathhouses. So here we are inside the 4 units of the bathhouses. The furthest one contains the steps that step up to the swimming pool itself. And you can see the girls section is on the left. The boys are going into the boys section on the right. And again, those entrances are in those cubicle units. At the corners, there's no door. In fact, it's not even totally clear where you go. You sort of have to trust that if you go into this dark cave, it's going to lead somehow into the bath complex or into the changing room. So there's a sense of drama here and almost mystery about this process. Notice too that above the doorway is a concrete slab. So the cement block walls support a very unadorned, very rugged concrete slab. We're beginning to see the birth here of what we're going to call brutalism, that distinctive architectural style of the 60s. It begins to come to life here in the bathhouses of 1955. Kahn's final drawing there on the left for the bathhouses, just to give a sense of how carefully he planned this out in terms of a kind of Cartesian geometry. This is really a geometrical exercise. The beauty of this, if it has any beauty, the beauty of this is in the proportions and in the measurements. The walls are not beautiful, the roofs are not beautiful, but as a whole, it has a kind of intellectual rigor that is very exciting to people who study architecture. Inside, you see what I mean? The use of that corner block, in this case, as supposed to house the bathrooms. And then look how the roof floats above the wall. It just seems to have, like a bird, to have somehow settled here, and it is nesting on top of the concrete block walls. Again, as humble as this structure is, and it may strike you as very ordinary, students of architecture have fallen in love with this for now generations. This is a much admired piece of architecture for students who are learning how to design buildings of their own. The clarity of this, the simplicity of this, the intellectual seriousness of this, even though it's a small, inexpensive project, it's approached in such a serious way. And that was very much Kahn's approach. You see him here in the outskirts of Pittsburgh, 1960. Kahn is crouching down and he's making sure that the bricks are laid properly. And they're not lovely bricks. I mean, they're cement block, but he wants them to be laid perfect. He is obsessive. Kahn is obsessive about the details. This contributes, I fear, to Kahn's early death, because he is so focused on the details and he is so unrelenting and so tireless in the pursuit of a kind of perfection in architecture that he disregards his health, and he rather egregiously disregards the questions of money. So he's constantly broke and frantic to find more employment and more employment and more employment throughout the 60s. Now, I'll mention again the Villa Savoie. Le Corbusier's style of architecture is now going to change. The Villa Savoie, so famous, it's even got its own Lego set. By 1950, this building is 20 years old, and Le Corbusier is changing. Le Corbusier is no longer interested in the mechanical. Le Corbusier is no longer interested in the steamship and the white walls of the ship and exposing the steel structure. World War II has intervened. There's a lot of cynicism and pessimism now about technological progress in some quarters. And so Le Corbusier built some little houses outside of Paris in 1951 that are really a new approach, the Maisons Jaoul. And in these buildings, in these houses, Le Corbusier rejects that white, plain aesthetic. And everything here is rugged, heavy walls, heavy brick, and especially immensely heavy concrete. That use of concrete to indicate, again, the floor slabs, but exaggerating the weight, the heft of the floors. These houses by Le Corbusier are going to be extremely influential in the United States in the mid-50s. We're going to see the impact of this on Lou Kahn. We're also going to see the impact of this on Bob Venturi. If you think about the Guild House by Bob Venturi of 1961, that huge column on the downstairs floor here is repeated by Venturi in Philadelphia in the 60s. So Le Corbusier's turn towards something much more natural, much more organic, less machine-based, more nature-based, this is going to have a big impact. And in particular, it's going to point American architects in the direction of exposing the concrete and leaving the concrete rough. Le Corbusier coins a term, béton brut, rough concrete, exposed, unfinished concrete. And that term béton brut becomes brutalism as a style of architecture so popular in America in the 1960s and 70s. Finally, Kahn gets his big commission in Philly, and it's going to be the science labs at the University of Pennsylvania. Here's a view of the campus in the mid-50s, and if you look down at number 9 on the picture, that's the Richard Labs under construction. So this is a location of these scientific laboratories in the heart of the University of Pennsylvania campus. And of course, Kahn had been a student here. Kahn knew that all the architecture was Gothic, collegiate Gothic, sort of Jacobean, actually. Kahn does not care about this sort of historical architecture. Kahn is going to ignore the campus as it existed in the 1950s. Kahn's idea is, I'm going to build a masterpiece building, but it's not going to respond to its location. This is one of the things that Bob Venturi is going to rebel against. Bob Venturi is going to say, no, you've got to respond to the location. You've got to respond to the history of the place. Venturi believes that. Kahn does not. And so the Richard Labs look like nothing else at the University of Pennsylvania. In fact, when these are finished in 1959, these look like nothing else in America. This is an astounding, innovative, strange building. You remember the corner blocks at the bathhouses that I mentioned. Well, he uses the corner blocks here too, but they're transformed now into these towers, into these brick towers, almost like, again, some sort of medieval castle. The towers soaring up, totally windowless. Those are the servant spaces. Like those utilitarian corners at the bathhouses, this is where all of the mechanical equipment is housed. The air conditioning and the lighting and all the electrical, everything is pushed into those corners so that the servant spaces, or rather the served spaces, are unencumbered. And the served spaces, as you can plainly see, are the glass-walled laboratories for the scientists at the University of Pennsylvania. It is such a complex plan. It reveals itself to us instantly from the outside. That modernist form follows function. We really see that here. Whatever the function is inside the building is fully revealed on the outside by the form of the building. And it is a complicated form. The construction of the building is radically new. The building is assembled from over 1,000 precast pieces of concrete. So this is not concrete poured in place. This is something new. This is concrete that is precast as a piece. So the architect specifies what does he want the piece to look like. It's precast in a factory, and it's delivered to the building site and assembled like a jigsaw puzzle or like a Chinese puzzle. This technology had originated in Germany after World War II. There was no steel in Germany. They turned to concrete. They had to rebuild all those bridges in Germany. And so they started precasting pieces of concrete and shipping them out to build bridges. The guy who was doing this in Germany comes to the United States. He partners with Kahn, and they come up with this, I think, extraordinary scheme for a new way of building a building. And so you see the building, the Richards Labs, under construction. And I think you can see how those are individual concrete pieces that all kind of snap together, in a sense, forming the structural units. This is extraordinarily new. This building was manufactured in a factory in New Jersey. And the building, piece by piece, was put on trucks and shipped to Philadelphia. This has got to be a first in the history of American architecture, that a building was created in another state and then re-erected, fully erected in another place entirely. So it's a new, exciting technological innovation, and it's a key technology today. This is the standard approach today to building concrete buildings and concrete bridges and concrete everything. And Kahn was a real pioneer. And today, did you know this? Concrete is the most abundant man-made material on the planet. This concrete construction has taken over the world to the point that it is getting harder and harder to find the crushed rock that you need to mix with the cement to make the concrete, so that the world of the future may have to find a new solution not involving concrete. But for better or worse, it's Kahn innovates this, and Kahn who really gives us the concrete world that we live in now. But I need to mention too that if you know anything about concrete, it's very fragile. I mean, if you had a concrete beam, just concrete, and you dropped it on the ground, it would probably break in two. You know that. A piece of concrete is not really that strong. What makes this strong is there are steel rods or wires inside, cast inside these pieces of concrete. And what the men are doing here in the construction of the Richards Labs is they're using pneumatic devices to tighten the steel inside the concrete beam to stiffen that concrete. It's called post-tension. Super high tech. Super high tech. So I want to give you a sense of how really modern this technology was in the late 50s. And Kahn exposes all of this as you approach the building. You see those concrete pieces. They are very much on display. The walls, the brick walls, are really kind of a curtain wall. They're quite thin over the concrete frame. The bricks perfectly flush with the windows themselves. Very elegant. You approach through the corner in a quirky. You can look up then, and you see all that concrete above your head. That is brutalism now coming into being. And inside, concrete overhead as well. The building opens in 1960. These were, again, scientific laboratories. I think a lot of them, unfortunately, were used for animal testing, as they did back then. But the scientists didn't like these labs. The scientists did not like these labs. And it's kind of a famous case of the genius architect kind of running away with the project and giving the scientists something that they hadn't asked for. The scientists didn't like the very small laboratories. It was hard to collaborate because you had to go wander through this maze of halls to find the next scientist if you wanted to talk. The labs couldn't be made any bigger. But the biggest problem was the glass. All this glass. I think very few scientists want a big glass wall in their laboratory because it's either too hot or too cold. And there were terrible problems with that. The building suffered so many problems, the University of Pennsylvania wanted to tear it down. But meanwhile, 50 architectural magazines had praised this building as the most exciting American building of the 1950s. This was the big breakthrough for Lou Kahn. This is what made his name really, really famous, was Richards Labs. Today it's been restored, the glass is improved, and there are no labs. It's now more like conference rooms, classrooms, for which it is better suited. I've tried to introduce Kahn to you. I hope I've helped you appreciate him. I could talk all day about the remainder of his career in the 1960s and early 1970s. I would love to tell you about Erdman Hall at Bryn Mawr College, a very exciting dormitory by Luke Kahn of 1965. But we don't have time. But I'll leave that as a tantalizing suggestion to you to go to Bryn Mawr and take a look at Erdman. It's terrifically interesting. And I'd love to talk to you about the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. You may have seen pictures of the Salk Institute. This is a truly famous American building by Luke Kahn, 1962-63. Concrete, and more brutalist concrete. But we need to shift now away from Luke Kahn and talk about the gentleman who's sitting next to Luke Kahn at this conference table in Philly in 1970. This is an architectural jury for some contest, and you see Kahn with his finger to his mouth as he's pondering some deep problem. Kahn was very abstract in his public persona. And the man in the middle is Bob Venturi. Bob Venturi had been Luke Kahn's assistant. He'd worked in Luke Kahn's office. These two men were very close in the mid-1950s. And the question arises, did Luke Kahn influence Bob Venturi's architecture? Or did the young Bob Venturi influence Luke Kahn's architecture? This is a hotly debated subject. Anytime I point out that Venturi seems to have taken something from Kahn, one of Venturi's associates or friends will say, no, it was Lou who was stealing from Bob and not giving Bob any credit. So this remains a question. But these two have a fascinating, complex relationship, these two Philadelphia architects. Bob grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs. They grew up rather poor. His father was an Italian immigrant and importer of fruit, but it was a home filled with books. His parents greatly valued education. They sent Bob to Princeton University, class of 1947, and then he stays on to get his architecture degree until 1950. So Bob had a lot of college education. And this is going to be a 20th century phenomenon. Most architects of the older period, it might have spent 4 years on a campus or not, but Bob had spent 7 years at Princeton. And then he goes on to teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and he teaches at Yale. So I think to understand Bob Venturi, you've got to see him in a university context. You've got to see him with the expansion of the universities after the Second World War, and more schools of architecture with more and more students. And he is teaching and teaching and teaching. Growing up in Philly, he falls in love with old Philadelphia. He loves the old buildings. He loves the colonial revival. He loves all those things that in the 50s you weren't supposed to love. The 50s was the pits for historic preservation. The 50s is when they were tearing everything down. The 50s is when they tore down all those buildings around Independence Hall. You know, they tore down a whole Victorian city around Independence Hall to make it grass. And then the 60s is when they tore down the whole waterfront of Philadelphia, the whole colonial waterfront, and they put a freeway. So it was a terrible time in a way to be in Philly, but Bob Venturi loves the old stuff, and he hates to see it go. So his attitude is quite different from some of these modernists. And so what Bob is going to do in his career, his celebrated career, I mean, Bob's even got a postage stamp. That's pretty good, huh? His mother's house is on a postage stamp. Bob Venturi is going to try to find ways of bringing in all the old historical details into modernism. A radical idea, because as I've said again and again, what the modernists want to do more than anything else is kill history. Modernists want to get rid of history and start over. Bob Venturi says, wait a minute, no, we're not starting over. We're going to evolve modernism in a way that brings in elements of the historical past. Postmodernism. Bob never liked that term, postmodernism. He'd always say, I'm not a postmodernist. But everybody says he invented postmodernism. I wrote a book on the architecture of Princeton University. And I guess that was my first opportunity to really study Bob Venturi's work. I have a whole chapter about Wu Hall, the dining complex on the Princeton campus, and trying to understand Wu Hall and trying to present this architecture in a way that the reader could understand it. That gave me an opportunity to really try to understand what Bob was all about. And it's not easy. It's not easy. It requires a lot of knowledge of the history of architecture. But I could just say that in this building of 1980, it's a modernist building. It's got the flat roof. It's got the strips of windows like Le Corbusier. If you look inside the building, you can even see the Le Corbusier columns, the white columns. But there's a lot of historical reference. You see the big keystones, like in Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. You'll see the big keystones there, and you'll see decorative brickwork and all kinds of other details from the historical past. So these things combine in Venturi's work. When he dies in 2018, he's hailed all over the world. I mean, I wish you could have seen the newspaper commentary from all over the world, because he's very famous in England as the designer of the National Gallery of Art in London. He built buildings all over the world at the height of his fame after 1985. But the New York Times headline, he would not have liked that New York Times headline, architect who rejected modernism. And Bob would always say, I'm a modernist. Over and over. How many thousands of times did he? I'm a modernist. He really believed he was a modernist, and he was developing modernism in a new direction, not rejecting modernism. And he didn't like heroic modernism. He didn't like what was happening in the 50s and 60s with people like Minoru Yamasaki, the Seattle architect, who designed the World Trade Center. Now, if you remember the World Trade Center, it was two giant boxes. And that was heroic modernism of the 60s. That the architect would design something and you'd like it or not, because the architect was a kind of genius figure. Yamasaki had given Princeton the Woodrow Wilson School that you see here. And I don't want to knock the Woodrow Wilson School, but I think Venturi would have said, you can take it in at a glance. When you take one glance at it, you've figured it out. And you don't even need to walk around it, because if you walk around the outside, it looks the same on all sides. He said they hardly had to do any architectural drawings. He looked this up. There was something like 14 architectural drawings instead of hundreds that you would expect. There was something like 14, because the whole building is so simple, so minimalistically modern, so pure. Yamasaki had built the science building at Harvard, which I think is arguably one of the ugliest buildings in the United States. I mean, it's modernism, but it's so cold, it's so precast, it's so clunky. Venturi said, we've got to evolve beyond this. Modernism is reaching a dead end as every town in America starts to fill up with these big, clunky, modernist edifices. When I lived in Seattle, I did like the Seattle Tower by Yamasaki, but it's the sort of thing Venturi couldn't stand. You take it in at a glance, very obvious. It's very, very brash. It says, I'm a monumental statement. I'm a piece of art. Take it or leave it. And it doesn't care about the context. It just plunks down like it's a spaceship landing. It's thrilling. It's a thrilling building. But it's not what Venturi thought modernism ought to be. He wanted to evolve away from this, away from that extreme minimalism that Yamasaki was promoting. And I just picked Yamasaki out of hundreds and hundreds of others. This is the sort of architecture that Venturi thought was complete banality. Mies van der Rohe said, in architecture, less is more. And Venturi said, no, no, less is a bore. You would have thought the World Trade Centers were deadly boring. In a famous sketch by Venturi, he ridicules these buildings that say, I am a monument. Look at me. Pay attention to me. I am a monument. He didn't want that. He said, these are all ducks. That was his nickname for this type of building, because there's a little shack on Long Island there on the left that's shaped like a duck. And each of these, whether it's a donut or the duck or the Yamasaki building, they're all showing off. They all say, look at me. I'm different from everything around me. I'm striking. I'm bold. I'm a great artistic statement. Look at me. That's not what he wanted. He said architecture should be just a shed, just a plain, simple, rectangular building, but it should be decorated. It should have adornment. It should even have commercial lettering on it. This is shocking to the modernists. What do you mean decorated? Decorated was a dirty word. Decorated was the dirtiest word that a modernist could use. You don't want to decorate. You don't want to adorn. But Venturi says, no, let's bring back decoration. And you can see this if you go to the Princeton campus and walk around. You'll see Yamasaki's Woodrow Wilson School at the top, and you'll see a few blocks away Venturi's Science Building at the bottom. And that's the difference between the duck, the great sculptural monument of Yamasaki, and then the decorated shed of Venturi. And Bob said, you know, that building was very cheap to build. My building was just a box. It's not complicated on the outside. There's no great cost involved in building a box, not like the temple of Yamasaki, which is so expensive. He's found a way to build more cheaply. But look, the walls are all decorated. They're richly colorful. The bricks form fascinating patterns. There's even carving around the front door, which would have horrified modernist. So this is postmodernism that Bob Venturi invents almost single-handedly. And this is the difference. This is what's happened to architecture between 1965 at the top, 1985 at the bottom, thanks to Bob Venturi. But he starts at the University of Pennsylvania, and he starts with that close collaboration with Lou Kahn, and then a close collaboration with his wife, Denise Scott Brown. He meets Denise in 1960. They're both teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. They're both the outcasts because they're the only two people who are beginning to question the traditions of modernism, the rules of modernism. These two are the rebels. And they teach together, and they produce many, many courses and lots of colorful posters and slides, like the one you see here, that accompany their teaching. And I think to understand their career, and it's a joint career. This is very modern too, for the genius architect to give credit to his designer wife, to share the credit with a woman. That's extremely modern. Everything about Venturi is modern, is up to date. Many of his ideas came from Denise, or as he always called her, Denise. He was very close to Denise and really, really credited her with many, many, many of his ideas. Many of the ideas from the lectures that they gave at the University of Pennsylvania went into his book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. 1966. This is a bombshell publication. This profoundly changes the direction of architecture in this country. Instead of modernism, which had become a set of rules and a very simple, basic, like 4 or 5 principles that you had to apply, Venturi says, no, no, life is complicated. Life is messy. Cities are messy. Let's celebrate complexity. And let's even celebrate contradiction. Let's break the rules. Let's see what doesn't work in architecture. Let's mingle things that don't really belong together. Let's take old architecture and mix it with the newest modernist ideas. And I have to say, too, before I talk about his mother's house, this is 1961, and we're getting into the 60s. And you cannot separate Bob Venturi from the ethos of the 60s. It's irreverent. And Bob was irreverent. Like Mad Magazine in 1961 was irreverent. It says it's going to be a mad year. It's going to be a mad decade, the 60s. The 60s is going to be crazy because, as you know, with movies, television, magazines, books, all the old ideas are being questioned. Everything is getting turned upside down. All the young generation is in college. The college is like a great laboratory experiment in new ideas. And Venturi and Denise Scott Brown are teaching these young college students. And crazy ideas are being floated. And let's try this. Let's try that. So remember that spirit of irreverence and rule breaking and novelty and don't trust anyone over 30, all those 60s values, that really is part of the Venturi worldview. Let's talk about his mother's house. He's not getting many commissions. Like Lou Kahn before him, people are a little scared of Bob Venturi. He's such a radical. He's not getting much work. So he builds a house for his mom. And as a cost-cutting measure, he's going to live in the house. He'll live in the house too. It's out in Chestnut Hill. Every textbook of American architecture has a picture of Venturi's mother's house because it's where postmodernism begins. This is where it begins. And postmodernism is going to sweep the world. Although Bob, you see him walking down the driveway in a very early photograph, Bob could never have dreamed, not in his wildest dreams, with his crazy ideas that he'd hatched these up in his University of Pennsylvania studio. He could never have dreamt that this would change architecture completely. So we need to understand this little house, very modest, very unassuming, not very expensive. Bob was always proud he could build cheaply. He could build cheaply. But it is something new and weird and exciting. I always tell my students that I think the first thing you need to understand about his mother's house is that it looks like a child's drawing of a house. I mean, it's that elemental. If you ask a kid to draw a house, they're going to give you a big front door and a big window with mullions. And they're going to give you a gable roof, pointy roof, and a big chimney. So look at Bob's mother's house. It's a child's rendition of a house. The big front door, a big window there on the left, the pitched roof, and the oversized chimney. In other words, it is a decorated shed. What's going on behind that facade is complicated, and we'll go around the back, we'll see that. But what you see from the driveway, the long suburban driveway, what you see from the driveway is something very, very basic that communicates to you instantly, I am a house. I'm a house. And that's new. To go back to those basic values, rejecting the modernist flat roof, going back to those basic values is shockingly new in the early 60s. He always said, I'm a modernist. Over and over, I'm a modernist. And he said, my favorite modernist building is the Villa Savoye. Bob Venturi loved this building by Le Corbusier. And, you know, the scale of his mother's house is similar, and it's in this green, leafy setting, and it's approached by automobile. I mean, these are quite similar in a way to the concept of the Villa Savoye. And remember the long strip of the ribbon window here. Keep that in mind, the long strip of the window. And you'll see it again there on Bob's house, his mother's house at the lower right. So there are certain Le Corbusier references here. At the same time, just one block away is the Esherick House by Lou Kahn of about the same date. And it's one of the real pleasures of Philadelphia architecture that we can visit the Venturi house and the Lucan house on the same afternoon, just walk from one to the other and compare them. And everyone says, well, the Lucan house is so modern. It's got the flat roof. It's radically strange, unhistoric. And the Venturi house is clearly postmodern. But actually, there's some similarities. Look at the shape of the windows in the Lucan house. It's got a big square attached to kind of a tail, like a stripe. And then look at Venturi's mother's house, and it's the same exact thing, only it's flipped upside down. The big front door and that funny tail, the dark tail that goes up from the front door. So there is a relationship between these two men, and their goals are both modernist. So you have to understand Venturi's house as a modernist exercise. And I think really what Bob Venturi is doing is he's looking at Lucan's work and he's saying, okay, Lucan's house could be a dentist's office. It just doesn't say house. It doesn't communicate house. How do we communicate house? And so Bob looks at pictures of ordinary American houses. He loved that word ordinary. What's an ordinary house look like? Not an architect designed crazy modernist house. What does an ordinary house look like? It's got a big front door. It's got big windows, mullioned windows. It's got a pitched roof, got a big chimney. It's got flowers, like the picture you see there at the bottom. He's going to bring some of that back into modernism. He also looks around in Chestnut Hill. Chestnut Hill has some of the most beautiful houses in the United States, as you know, these beautiful homes of the teens and 20s. And Bob Venturi loves these houses. And Bob says, we can't afford to build like that now. We can't afford that. No one could build this now. But could we build something that refers to this, that makes reference to this? Not using the stone necessarily, but referring to it in some way. He also looks at some of the great shingle style houses of the late 19th century, like the famous Low House in Rhode Island. And Bob loved this house. He said, that says house, right? You look at that, you know that's a house. It has a big sheltering gable, big triangular gable, and a variety of window shapes, but it's unified under that big gable and that big chimney. This says house. And so the Low House by McKim, Mead, and White, I think is definitely referred to in Bob's mother's house. That big sheltering gable. And where the Low House has that porch off to the right side, that's where the ribbon windows are in Venturi's mother's house. So I think there's a definite echo here of the Low House. When Bob traveled to England, the first stop he made on the first day was to see Blenheim Palace. He really wanted to see Blenheim Palace. And he fell in love with Blenheim, and he loved that crazy roof. You stand in front of Blenheim Palace, and there's a big pediment, like a Greek temple. You see the big triangular pediment. But then above the pediment is a broken pediment. Extremely strange. I mean, this is sort of like a Baroque, wacky detail. Bob loved that broken pediment, and he specifically said that's where he got the idea for the split in the gable of the mother's house, the break at the top. So you wouldn't have known that, right, unless he had referred to it. But he's bringing in history. He's bringing in the past. He spent 7 years at Princeton, where the School of Architecture was in the same building with the art history department. So Bob had a lot of art history at Princeton. He knew Blenheim Palace. He knew the architecture of the past. He even puts a flower pot out front, I think, in a cheeky reference to the traditional American house that always has flowers out in the front. Now, look at the facade. It's a house like a child would draw it, but there are weird things going on here. Where is the front door? I mean, there's a big opening, but where's the door? It's a bit like Kahn's bathhouses. You have to look around to find the door. You have to enter the sort of dark void and then turn and hope that maybe that's but that's the door. And look at the windows. He's got the modernist ribbon window on the right. Recognize that? The long, skinny signature, really, of Le Corbusier. Over on the left, he's got a traditional window. Now, that may seem obvious to you. Yeah, windows look like that one on the far left, but modernist windows never looked like that. Modernism had banned that traditional type of window with the mullions. That had been banned. In fact, Bob would say the window had been relegated to oblivion by the modernists. I mean, they covered buildings in glass, but the window itself as a unit ceased to really matter very much with modernism. Bob would say that window there on his mother's house, that's when the window came back. He'd love to say that. That's when the window came back. And you could, again, for the first time in decades, build or design a traditional American window. And yet this is Bob, and it's huge. It's like wackily big. Also important here, the facade is very flat. That's modernism, right? We saw how Kahn's facades beautifully flat, beautifully smooth, no cornice at the top. But there are applied moldings. You see them? There are strips of wood that run across the facade, and there's even a strip of wood that makes a big bow-shaped arch over the front door. Unbelievably daring to do this in 1961. Very, very radically daring to apply a molding. Because moldings go back to the classical past. Moldings go back to Greece and Rome in the Renaissance. And no one had been allowed to use a molding or even think about a molding since 1935. And here the moldings come back. But being Venturi, he uses them in quirky ways. They don't quite fit the windows. They're supposed to be a little dislocating. Remember the title of his book, Complexity and Contradiction. He wants to shake it up. He wants there to be a contradiction. The molding doesn't quite hit the window in the way you'd think the molding would hit the window. It's all a little goofy. Around the back, and the back of the building's almost never photographed, but it's much more radically modernistic in the back. But you can see in the back that it is a decorated shed. Notice there on the left, the whole front wall is kind of a billboard. The whole front wall is a display that conceals, actually, that the house itself is rather smaller. There's his mom sweeping, and there's the same view today. Thankfully, beautifully preserved. And inside, a very cozy interior with a strange fireplace. And I think we'll sum it up here, actually, with this fireplace, because it refers to the traditional great big fireplace of the home in Chestnut Hill. If you've been lucky enough to go to one of those Christmas parties at one of those great homes, there's always a big fire roaring in the fireplace. So there's a reference here to the architecture that he loved as a boy in Philadelphia. But it's like no other fireplace in the world. Look at the shape of it, so odd. And the fact that the stairs are behind the fireplace. The stairs go snaking up and bend around the back of the fireplace in a way that is unspeakably awkward and peculiar. Form follows function, and all those neat rules of modernism are here distorted and bent. Forms are made to do things that aren't necessarily practical, that aren't necessarily expected. But the architect is experimenting. Bob Venturi has opened American architecture up now to a world of experimentation that's going to make American architecture in the 70s and 80s very exciting. All the new things that are tried. You may not love the architecture of that period. A lot of it's getting torn down. But I think the 70s and 80s are one of the most exciting moments simply for novelty. Bob Venturi gives architects permission to break rules, to try new things, to put moldings around the fireplace where no one would have been allowed to put a molding. in generations past. So I've taken you in some way from the traditional architecture that George Howe was practicing in the 19 teens and 20s. We saw how George Howe became a modernist around 1930, and how George Howe was joined by other modernists, Stoneroff, Lou Kahn. Now, by the 1950s, Philadelphia, under Lou Kahn, is a world center for the development of international style modernism. And then how unexpectedly, around 1960, this young disciple of Lou Kahn's, Bob Venturi, comes in and says, time for something new. Let's change this. So I would suggest to you that we're lucky in Philadelphia, aren't we? We're lucky to have these revolutionary Philadelphia architects, Howe, Stoneroff, Lou Kahn, and Bob Venturi. All right, thank you all very much. And if you have any questions, now would be your chance to ask.
Hi. This is so interesting. You haven't really talked about, I guess that when I saw the projects, the government projects, the new
Yes.
buildings for people, how did people respond to them during the time? Do you have any idea?
A lot of the public housing is not modernist, but some distinctly is. My sense is that in that era, the residents had very little say. I don't think they were organized in any way to
Right.
object. I would think the swimming pool and other amenities built in were considered a major plus. We forget how poor, desperately poor, the poor were during the Depression. So they probably considered those to be first-rate luxurious, given the conditions, the slum conditions that were being replaced.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, a lot of that early public housing now has been demolished, has deteriorated, has become horrible. So public housing, as we view it now, is tainted. We're very skeptical of the benefits of that.
Yeah.
As with modernism generally, I think we look back on Le Corbusier today as a kind of villain, and modernism as a unfortunate sacrifice of beauty and humane values in architecture. It seems much more complicated when you look back on it today.
Yeah. It seems like people are trying to kind of, like when people redid the Carver House, not the Carver House, the
Oh yeah, the Carver Court.
Carver Court, trying to like bring it back to a more traditional look. Maybe partly for functional reasons, like those flat roofs. I don't know how well they work, but there just seems to be this constant push-pull between the two, as we can see through the history of all of this. So
I
interesting.
think if you look at American houses in general, there's some wonderfully modernistic American houses, but in general, if you think about most of your friends, they probably live in a traditional house. I mean, it's extraordinary the extent to which people prefer to live in traditional houses.
Yeah.
That some, of course, there'll always be some that want to live in a Lou Kahn house, but most people really cling to very old-fashioned traditional ideas of what a house should be.
Yeah.
I had a
And
question.
we're 100 years after Le Corbusier, so he would be appalled, I think, that we haven't embraced his ideas as much as he wanted.
Yeah, I had a question about did the architects at all recommend or restrict or make any suggestions regarding the interior materials? Did they suggest using woods or fabrics to soften things, or did they not get involved in the interior design as much?
With the public housing specifically?
Well, with homes more, I'm thinking, or public buildings either.
Yeah, one of the exciting things in studying this mid-century architecture are all the new materials that are coming in. And there's an explosion of new possibilities, fluorescent lighting, for example, neon lighting, air conditioning, coils under the floor to warm the house or even to warm the sidewalks so the snow melts. The bent plywood that we saw in the Wasserman house. There are innumerable things now that an architect can play with that didn't exist before. And that's one of the exciting things. And I love visiting buildings from this period and spotting, hey, wait, that's the original ceiling tile. That's the original linoleum floor. Those little details, new materials that were coming in that were very exciting for architects. I think the situation today is that there's so many materials now, new ones coming online every minute. I sometimes feel sorry for architects. I think they're just overwhelmed by the possibilities now. But back then it was far more limited.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question?
Well, just because of curiosity, did you know Venturi? It sounds like you.
I did. In preparing this lecture, I've been blessed to have met several of the people involved in this story. And I got to know Bob through work at Princeton. And I was a student there at the time that he was transforming the campus, and we students were all very skeptical of Bob Venturi. He was so cerebral, and we thought he was pulling something over on us with this architecture. I mean, a lot of us were modernists in that day in the early 80s, and he came in with decoration and ornament and adornment and historical references, and all of this seemed pretty shocking to us at that time. But boy, over the years, I have really come to admire him for his rigor and his commitment to cost savings. You know, he didn't want architecture. He didn't want architects to be associated with profligate spending and goofy buildings that don't work. He had a real practical streak, not always emphasized. I mean, I think we emphasize that he was so innovative and daring and irreverent, but also a hard-working, practical architect who wanted to please the client. And I might add too that many of Bob's buildings have been modified in bad ways. There are plans underway to alter the National Gallery in London. Those have been very controversial. And here at the University of Delaware, there was a very distressing alteration to the Student Center there last summer. So it's a constant battle to preserve these buildings. Everyone hates the brutalisms. All the brutalist stuff's getting demolished, but we're seeing now the postmodern buildings starting to be either altered or torn down.
And replaced with what?
Whatever the latest thing is. But a lot of these postmodern details may be more whimsical. The use of big, colorful lettering that Venturi loved to bring in, a lot of that is getting removed. It seems out of date now. And this always is the case with architectural styles. After about 30 years, everyone sort of hates that style and they tear it down. And then after 50 years, suddenly everyone loves it again. And they wish that no one had torn it down. So we're at the point now, I think, where postmodernism is probably at the lowest ebb of popularity. And maybe it'll come back. By the time it comes back, I think much of it probably will be torn down. But thank you all so much. Thank you for taking class. Thank you for being interested in architecture. Go out this spring, drive around Philly, see these buildings, and enjoy our city in a new way. And thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
It was so interesting. I hope you teach another course soon.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted that you enjoyed it. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
really did. Learned a lot.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maynard.
Thank you.
Thank you.